Hey everyone, welcome to our very first episode of the Jacobin Show. I'm Jen Pan, and I'm here with my co-hosts Ariella Thornhill and Paul Prescod. Hi guys.
Hi.
Hey, great to be here.
Good to see you. So before we jump in, I just want to quickly mention that this is, of course, a brand new show on the Jacobin channel. We're going to be here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And if you're watching, you might already be familiar with Jacobin's very excellent Weekends show, which airs on Saturday. I think our show is going to be slightly different in that it won't be as news focused. We'll really be focusing each of our episodes each week on a specific theme or topic. So next week, we're actually going to be talking about the Democratic coalition after Trump. And the guest for that show is going to be Dan Kaufman, who is the author of the book, The Fall of Wisconsin. So he'll be kind of looking at how Democrats have been bleeding rural and industrial support in the Midwest for the last couple of decades. And he'll be focusing on Wisconsin as kind of a classic case study. And then the week after that, we'll be looking at the question of who counts as working class, which I think is kind of a debate that comes up from time to time in the media. I remember a few years ago, Charles Murray, the author of The Bell Curve, was saying that class was kind of this product of, the type of beer that you drink, or like whether you drive a truck, or the TV shows that you watch. And then, of course, other people sort of conceive of class as a product of your income or your education, or, kind of a combination of the above. So for that show, we're going to be unpacking that question a little bit, and we're going to have on the sociologist David Kalnitsky, who's going to talk about why we should actually understand class as relational rather than as like an individual identity attribute. So that's all coming later this month. Oh, and I should mention, for each show, it's going to be a different combination of myself, Ariella, Paul, and a guest. And tonight's guest is, of course, as you probably saw in the description, Vivek Chibber, who's a sociologist at NYU. And he's going to be joining the show a little later to kind of unpack how socialists have historically understood race and racial oppression in the US. And he's also going to be offering a left critique of critical race theory. So stay tuned for that. So for our show today, I want to start by, I guess, looking back at 2020. A lot of people have called the year a year of racial reckoning. And I think in many ways, that's a pretty accurate description. Over the summer, of course, we saw several high-profile instances of police violence. Those sparked mass nationwide protests, and the protests, I think, in turn, kind of generated this ongoing national discussion on the centrality of race and racism in the U.S. today. So I guess the question I, want to pose to you, Ariella and Paul, is to what extent is this racial reckoning actually something transformative? Because I think for me, a lot of the protests in the street do very much seem like a movement from below, right? But at the same time, over the summer, I personally was a little taken aback by how quickly the business sector, or like what we might call the investor class, rushed in to just immediately and enthusiastically embrace the racial reckoning. I think at this point, corporations, including Apple, Amazon, Uber, Microsoft, I think they've collectively donated something like over $2 billion to racial justice initiatives. Of course, tons of corporations are now pledging to diversify their boards, their C-suites, instituting anti-racism training for their workers. And then recently I saw that NASDAQ is talking about instituting a rule where if your company is listed on their exchange, it has to have two, quote, diverse directors, which they define as, anybody who's not a straight white male. So that's something that they're looking into. So I guess I on that note, I think that on the left, we're pretty used to looking at these types of corporate measures with a certain degree of skepticism, to put it mildly. But I want to quickly read a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is, of course, the legal scholar who coined the term intersectionality, because I think it kind of speaks to how not everybody views these types of measures the same way. So the quote is, She says, so this was something that she said in the New York Times. She says, you basically have a moment where every corporation worth its salt is saying something about structural racism and anti-Blackness. And that stuff is even outdistancing what candidates in the Democratic Party were actually saying. So just thinking about the quote, I wanted to ask you guys, what do you make of this? And more specifically, does the recent corporate embrace of anti-racism signal some kind of sea change?
Yeah, that's a big question, Jen.
Yeah, starting off light.
Yeah. I think it's exactly the question that needs to be asked after this stuff, though, because these proposals and initiatives have gained so much momentum. And there have been some critiques about how cynical it is that some companies are trying to capitalize off of this moment where violence against Black people is gaining attention or racial inequality is gaining attention. But it's very different than the movements that you see in the street. And there's no one unifying factor around those demands. I would say that when you look at the protests, you have to understand them as site specific. The kind of oppression that people are reacting against is particular. The way that police violence fits into that oppression is particular. And what these corporate initiatives do is they put a veneer of similarity over the entire thing, right? And they say the demand that we're getting is representation. So we saw, high profile actors saying, I'm not going to voice a Black cartoon character. That's pretty far down my list of
urgent priorities.
Yeah, things that Black people really care about. But these are individuals struggling to figure out what they should do and what their role is in a time where racism has become collapsed into an individual critique. Mm-hmm. And what these corporate initiatives are doing is doubling down on it and also changing the scope of transformation to say transformation is only what's within our power. So we can transform our workplace, we can transform our boards. None of us would say don't hire people of color. That's not what we're advocating in criticizing this. And even insofar as they're making the boardroom more diverse, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what is bad is twofold. One, it's that it's taking this grassroots momentum, true, real rage that has fueled and sometimes pessimism and despair that's fueled these movements. And it's reorienting that to say, let's put a corporate friendly face on this, empower us to change the world. Retrenchment isn't the problem. Let's not talk about redistribution. We need think tanks to research the question of racism.
I think it's also interesting how a lot of these corporations it seems like now they're really comfortable using terms like systemic racism or structural racism, or as Kimberly Crenshaw says in her quote, even, talking about anti-Blackness. And I think on a certain level that sounds radical, but it's also a way for corporations to be not very clear about what they're actually asking for, right? Like you can condemn systemic racism, but that doesn't mean you're going to raise wages for your workers.
Right. And I was going to say, my response to Crenshaw is it really outdistancing the Democratic Party candidates? Because from what I remember, most of the candidates did go through the motions and talked about structural racism. All of a sudden, everyone's talking about structural racism. I think this kind of points to the fact that if someone like Pete Buttigieg is talking about structural racism and Amazon and Walmart, it kind of points to how meaningless these gestures are becoming, and the left is getting very caught up in these gestures. And I think, always look at what are the corporations not putting their money into and what are they doing it instead. And like you said, Walmart has fought a union for 20, 30 years relentlessly. Think about all the money they've spent on that. They're not going to give their workers a raise, but they are going to donate millions of dollars. And we really need to pause and think about what is this money going to? And there's definitely a political strategic reason they're putting their money there and not somewhere else, like into their workers. And I'll say something generally, Ariella, talking about these protests being site specific, and this might be kind of a bomb I'm just dropping in here, but I think we also need to take a step back, because from what I've seen locally, and I'm in Philadelphia, by the way, and nationally, from what it appears to me, I think these protests have been majority white, definitely not exclusively white. And we got to think about what that means. And I get a little uncomfortable with comparing this moment to the civil rights movement or comparing it to the urban riots. I think something kind of strange is happening. Maybe the first time we've seen a kind of ethnic politics being driven by white people on behalf of non-white people. And we got to think about what that means. And even thinking about it, it's not clear to me that even defund the police is popular, widespread among people of color. My head's not totally wrapped around this, but I think we really need to step back and consider what's going on here. This is not like the civil rights movement part 2. This is not the urban riots part 2. I think the way these corporations are getting involved signals that something else is going on here.
Yeah, I think the question of, who is the membership of the movement or who is the constituency of the movement is really important. And there does seem to be at a couple different levels a split between the people who are speaking for, the movement or for a certain cause and the people they claim to represent. And I think we also see this so recently, there's been a lot of talk about Biden's cabinet appointments, and there's been a lot in the news about who he's appointing and whether his cabinet is diverse enough. So, Ariella, I know that you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I want to pose a question to you guys. Would you rather, that's a fun game, right? Would you rather a bloated white supremacist deny you a stimulus check, or a diverse, beautiful United Colors of Benetton ad deny you a stimulus check?
Such a tough call.
This is,
I lay awake at night thinking of this, so this is very relevant.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate to me, the kind of bald tokenism that seems to be playing into so many of these decisions. And it goes beyond that, because the Congressional Black Caucus has a lot of power. They have a lot of sway, and they're pushing for certain people in Biden's cabinet. And they're saying we need Black representation. This is something that's not unfamiliar to anybody who listened to Kamala Harris. When asked what she would bring to the administration, she's like, this was after she was like, I disavow socialism. Yeah, exactly. She was like, I will bring my personal experience as a woman of color. And that will inform my decisions and how I relate to this presidency. So I think there's something rhetorically happening there with the logic of liberalism that says, if we have a change in the hearts and minds, or the standpoint theory position of an individual in power, we will see a more just outcome for people of a similar background. But we know that that's not the case. And Kamala's record makes that very clear. She's a successful, savvy politician who really championed some draconian policies that specifically affected people of color. And so Biden's administration is like an object lesson in multicultural neoliberalism. We've got a Raytheon board member. Can we bring up that graphic? Lloyd J. Austin III, board member of Raytheon Technologies, a defense contracting company, who needs to get a waiver in order to serve as Secretary of Defense. And there is some pushback. People are saying this is supposed to be a civilian in this position. This man has 41 years, I think, of military experience. But
he's diverse.
Yeah, and that's been the defense there. It's wild to me that the categories of race have become so collapsed, calcified, and then they're moved around like a chessboard. And it's also wild to me that this is still happening when it doesn't seem to have yielded as much success for the Democratic Party as they wanted it to.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think that any working person of any race cares that the Office of Budget Management or whatever is filled by somebody who, quote, looks like them? Like, I just don't think that those are people's priorities. And it seems to me like the people or the groups that are advocating to fill those spots are always these groups like, you know, with Lloyd Austin, it's the NAACP, right? And we have other groups, other racial advocacy groups who are pushing to fill cabinet spots with, you know, whatever racial group they claim to represent. But I guess the question is like, do those groups represent actual people?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what else here, I don't know whether to call this like naive or out of touch, but there's been an established Black political class in this country for a long time. And many people, Black and white, have for a very long time, for generations, lived under representatives at all levels of the political, you know, arena that are Black. So I think it's a little weird. I think a lot of people are kind of past this, like this idea that there's someone Black in politics is not blowing people's minds in large. And I think even the Obama experience, I mean, it was, in a way, it was kind of powerful in that sense, but it's just almost like they're acting like we're back at 1967 and we got the first Black mayor elected, and people's minds are going to be blown if there's Black people in the cabinet. And it seems kind of weirdly out of touch, where I think where many Black
Oh, Paul, you cut off for a second, but I think it's absolutely true. We are being told to trade the expectation of real distributive political gains and economic gains, real economic justice, for a face that looks like yours. You know, I don't fault people that think, I want to see somebody who looks like me be successful, you know? I think that as an individual form of validation, that's apolitical, to be honest. But I do think that it becomes political when the political and corporate class tell you that's all you'll get. You can live in decrepit public housing in the richest country in the world, but a Black woman will be running HUD.
Right.
One with no experience in housing whatsoever, by the way.
Right. Yeah, there's that element. And I think a flip side to that is when you see these neoliberal interests try to claim that policies that are actually very bad for working people of all races are some sort of like racial justice initiatives. And I think that's becoming more and more common. So one example I wanted to look at in regards to this, it comes out of California. You guys probably remember for the last election, there was a ballot measure, Proposition 22 in California, which was a ballot measure that sought to reclassify gig workers. So like Uber drivers, Instacart shoppers, and, you know, other app-based workers. The ballot measure was to reclassify them as independent contractors, which obviously, you know, is a move that would undermine some pretty serious labor protections for those workers, including minimum wage and overtime,
unemployment benefits.
Exactly. Unemployment in many cases, and collective bargaining. So this is just like a categorically bad policy. And of course, Silicon Valley pours $200 million, maybe more, into this ballot measure in order to pass it. And it did pass. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of this was you actually saw certain racial advocacy groups endorsing Proposition 22. So California's NAACP chapter endorsed, a Latino advocacy group called Si Se Puede Foundation endorsed Prop 22, and so did a branch of Al Sharpton's National Action Network. And I want to look specifically at California's NAACP, which is was led by this woman, Alice Huffman, who also runs a PR consulting firm, which accepted money from, you know, the Yes on Prop 22 campaign to kind of campaign for the proposition and do PR for it. And the reason why I think this example is really interesting is because she specifically framed her support and the NAACP's support for Proposition 22 as a racial justice measure. So, she, as part of her kind of PR work, what she did is she wrote a lot of op-eds. There's one where she was featured in a lot of ads. She ran an op-ed titled "Why Communities of Color Support Proposition 22," and she basically was like, Proposition 22 is good for Black and brown workers. So I'm going to read a quote from another one of her op-eds. She writes about Proposition 22, "It's a win-win that will save hundreds of thousands of jobs for Black and brown workers and for all Californians who are choosing independent, app-based work." So we basically just talked about how, Proposition 22 is a disaster for workers. It probably won't surprise anybody that the majority of these gig workers in California are actually not people who are white, right? So this, in a way, is the furthest thing I can possibly imagine from a racial justice measure. But I think this example sort of speaks to how easy it is to use that language to serve your needs, and how adept, as Paul, you say, the kind of like professional strata of these like race relations managers, how adept they are at using that language.
Yeah, and I think, there's a strategic question here. Uber and Lyft can't fake, if the demand is a union and a certain wage and benefits, they can't fake it. But if we center other things like a vague call for diversity, that's something they can fake or even actually institute very well. So, and this, this is important. Again, it's not just an academic point, but from an organizer standpoint, it's like, what are we framing? And, how are we framing this fight? And what is a better terrain for us? Because Uber and Lyft can't talk their way or fake their way out of, you're either paying your workers a certain amount or you're not. They either have a union or not. When it comes to diversity, they are very skilled, and I think are becoming more skilled at faking it.
Mm-hmm. So I think, as I was saying earlier, like I think lots of people on the left sort of understand that corporations at this point will like do these dirty tricks and kind of play these games and are really good at sort of commandeering this rhetoric. But I want to look at the academy and at NGOs for a second, because Paul, I know that you had some comments on on the Center for Anti-Racism. So take it away.
All right.
Oh, it was too spicy.
Yeah, I think they're listening to the feed and they're like, "Don't bring that Jack Dorsey."
Right. Yeah, I don't know what's happened. But I think, Kale, you have the article up there. So Jack Dorsey, who's the co-founder of Twitter, he donated $10 million to the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. And that is associated with, speaking of cabinet positions, I think Ibram Kendi X is running for race czar. That's what I think he's trying to do here. Who, he's a thinker on so-called anti-racism. So, it says of the total gift, $9 million is going to go to their endowment. $1 million will be available for immediate use. And so, my first question is like, what the hell is anti-racist research? Like what is it? And how much more research do we really need to do? Like, we know there's massive inequality and disparities in healthcare, education, and income. And right now we need a political solution to this disparity. It's not a matter of doing more research. And I'll put up a certain quote here, because this is not just about revolutionizing research, but if Kendi seeks to revolutionize academia's approach to studying racism, Dorsey wants to revolutionize how billionaires give away their money. In April, he announced the creation of Start Small with the aim of funding global COVID-19 relief, girls' health and education, efforts towards a universal basic income, and most recently, social justice reform. And so, one thing here is notice what he aims to fund. COVID-19 relief could mean anything. Girls' health and education is vague. Increasingly today, when you say social justice, you're talking about just criminal justice reform. And just notice, he's not going to put money into Medicare for all or a job guarantee or free higher education. And, Jane McAleaver has made this point a lot recently, that all liberals ever do is kind of create commissions to study the same problem over and over again and never offer a solution. And this really seems like that same kind of liberal approach. And it's like research by tech giants is not going to get us anywhere. We know that Medicare for all will help end health disparities. We know that taxing the rich will increase funding for public service. We know that unions will increase wages for workers, especially Black workers. So right now, what we need is a political struggle to win these things. So maybe that money would be better well spent, in political lobbying. Or why isn't he donating to a down ballot candidate that is really, championing these causes? And we know the Twitter founders of the world are never going to donate to the Bernies of the world or.
Yeah, I also want to point out that I read somewhere recently that Twitter's revenue last quarter was literally over 900 million. So like donating 10 million, I mean, like I'll take it, but like it's kind of a drop in the bucket for, the Silicon Valley overlords,
I will 50 cents to that.
Right.
And I solved it. Don't make people independent contractors so they'll be able to have access to healthcare.
Right.
Ta-da! Give me $10 million.
Also one last point is, you don't really need a commission or like a center, like an academic center for Medicare for all or raising the minimum wage. I mean, obviously there's like a ton of research you can do in that area. And like people do work on, of course, labor and healthcare. But I kind of feel like that's the difference between a policy demand and, I guess call for more research or like a center or like an NGO.
Yeah, I think
it's like solving racism through lab coats.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Why are these people so upset? It's not like we have, the written word of hundreds of people who've experienced this.
Now, Ariella, I think we have to study this for a couple more decades, and I'm also going to need 10 million.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, too, that billionaires are throwing their weight behind UBI. Andrew Yang has done a UBI pilot that actually our upcoming guest, David Kelnitz, calls really slow lottery because it's a very small amount of money. He's like, that's not really an income necessarily. Yeah. But they are looking at these, and, we can have a serious debate about this another time about what UBI does and what its role is. But it's very, very telling that this portion of the political class is donating to research that or fund it in the same breath as the kind of hollowed out cries for reform around race or gender.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So I'm actually seeing now that we have Vivek Chibber on with us. Jacobin watchers will probably know Vivek Chibber. He is the editor of Catalyst, which is Jacobin's sister publication. He's also a sociologist at NYU and a longtime contributor to Jacobin. So Vivek, welcome to the debut episode of the Jacobin Show.
Thanks. Is my mic working?
It's working.
Yes.
Okay, thank God. Thanks very much. Glad to be here and glad to see this show get off the ground. It's going to be a very important contributor, I think, to the left. So congratulations.
Thanks.
Glad to have you on. So before you jumped in, we were kind of looking back at, 2020 as this year of racial reckoning. We started by talking about the street protests and how, that kind of not evolved, but was in a way supplanted by this sort of corporate anti-racism. And then we talked a little bit about Biden's diversity cabinet picks and, various ballot measures in California. So I want to turn to you now just to get your thoughts on kind of what you've seen over this past year in terms of the racial discourse. And I guess what I wanted to ask you in particular is whether you see this kind of uprising against police violence as something that can open a space for a left agenda or open a space where we can push for the expansion of public goods?
To start with the end of your question, absolutely. What we saw was a national uprising against a very brutal carceral regime in this country. And that uprising was wide, not only very wide in its scope, but it was very widely supported. Mm-hmm. And in my lifetime, there has not been a time in this country when the issue of racial injustice and white supremacy, as you could call it, has been taken up by mainstream culture in such a profound way. Now, that could become a way to address the material roots of racial oppression if the social forces to push it in that direction were there. Now, the basic rule of politics is whenever an issue becomes a contested issue in politics, the social groups, the classes that are best positioned to take advantage of it will be the ones that turn it towards themselves and to their own favor. We are now in a situation where working class blacks in the inner cities, the most impoverished sections of the black community, have very little organized power and have no real entree to the political system. Therefore, not surprisingly, what's happened is that calls for racial justice have been turned very, very quickly into calls for greater upward mobility for black elites and for the black professional and managerial class. That happened literally within hours. And so, not surprisingly, the term racial justice now basically means whatever helps upwardly mobile blacks fulfill their career objectives and their career missions. And this is why you see the corporate sector so avidly backing calls. When was the last time you saw a ruling class say, yes, we demand racial justice? it would be a miracle in history if suddenly the American corporate community really started to get behind an actual plan to redistribute resources towards impoverished and working class blacks. So obviously, when you see this stuff happening, it's no surprise that it gets turned into a political tool for the most privileged sections of the community that supposedly is now to be the beneficiary of these shifts.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because, the cogs are already there for that class. And you can see that the narrative that they're building around racial justice is really nested in things that have existed since the 80s, ideas around privilege theory, ideas around representation, standpoint theory, these things that kind of get already baked into corporate policies because
not just corporate policies, the sphere in which the Black and the Latino middle class circulates, which is professionals, politicos, nonprofits, the corporate community. These are the spheres in which they circulate, and this is why, there are two ways you can understand identity politics. Okay? One is you can understand it as anti-oppression. The other is you can understand it as anti-discrimination. And oppression has to do with people's life chances. That it's a situation of social dominance in which the necessities of life are being denied to people either through legal channels because there's legal discrimination against them, like an apartheid state or disenfranchisement or something, or through institutional channels, which are informal but still very, very obdurate. And then you say, okay, what is it that keeps these things in place? And you're going to say the left has always said it's material inequalities. It's the lack of resources on the part of the poor. And so an anti-oppression politics has to center around a redistribution of economic resources to people. Now, anti-discrimination politics is an entirely different cat. What that's saying is, look, the problem is that people with real skills, real talents, who could be doing well in a market society are being kept from doing well because their talents are not being adequately rewarded and adequately recognized. By whom? By the market, by employers, by academic institutions, by the corporate community, et cetera, et cetera. Anti-discrimination politics have always been the provenance of upwardly mobile, middle class and elite members of society. And historically, whenever the labor movement and the left has been powerful, when it has taken up issues of social domination, whether it's gender or whether it's race or whether it's ethnicity, it has tied them to an agenda of economic redistribution. Not because it thinks there's nothing more in the world than economic redistribution, which is what the left is accused of, but because it knows that without that economic redistribution, an anti-oppression agenda will simply turn into an anti-discrimination agenda. All right, so who does that benefit? It's going to be the people already well-positioned in society and who are finding themselves frustrated by social attitudes, social mores, informal institutional blockages. And that's what we're seeing right now, is that because of the political and organizational weakness of the Black working class and the Latino working class, I should say, since we're now in America, Latinx working class, so that the 1% of Latinos who use this term can be happy. because they're so organizationally weak, they have no way of turning these riots, turning these mobilizations into a sustained anti-oppression politics. And therefore, it's being turned into something that it is natural and appealing to the upwardly mobile sections of those communities.
Thanks, Vivek. I'm back, hopefully for good. So next question is, so, I mean, one demand that's been really gathering steam is defund the police. And of course, different people kind of mean different things by that. And it, so far, we're not really sure how popular it is. So one of my fears about it is that, like, we're facing a massive austerity push. And this might drown out kind of a more fundamental demand of taxing the rich. And I think it kind of almost in a way adopts an austerity mindset, because I think it adopts the same mindset that we can't change the pot of money. We just have to shift it around more, instead of saying, there is money out there and we need to go to the rich to get it. So, I mean, what do you think about this? Are these two things in conflict, this idea of anti-austerity and defund the rich? And even more broadly, I mean, can you talk about how important this anti-austerity fight and saving the public sector is going to be for specifically Black workers?
Yeah, I mean, let's separate out two things. One is the value of something as a slogan. It's a slogan, an effective slogan around a political program. And then the program itself, whether we should be happy or supportive of that program. There's a fundamental problem with defund the police as a slogan, which is that you have to immediately explain that that's not really what you mean. And anytime you have a slogan that you have to explain, in which the content of it turns out to be not only not exactly what the slogan is saying, but in tension with what the slogan is saying, you've got a problem. And my opinion, it's not a very good slogan at all, primarily because if you think crime is real, and if you think there really is a real incidence of violent crime and of violence within impoverished communities, then not only is it impractical to say that we want to, quote, defund the police, but that slogan is going to be rejected by those very communities themselves, unless you give them something else in return. Now, historically, when labor movements have been powerful, they've never wanted big police forces. So everybody on the left wants to defund the police, as it were, but only if in exchange you're giving people jobs, real opportunities, public funding, real employment, things like that. Now, in the United States, that right now is not on the agenda. So when you're saying defund the police and people take you literally, what you seem to be saying to them is, we're not going to give you jobs and the public funding and the public institutions and all that stuff. We're not even talking about it. And we're not going to address real issues of crime in your neighborhoods. One of the problems in the left today is it doesn't want to admit that crime exists. And it does exist. And that's the reason it doesn't want to admit it, is that it's mostly in very privileged sections of society that the left subsists. That's where it circulates. It doesn't live in the neighborhoods that it claims to be talking about and seeking to argue in favor of. So in my view, a better slogan that encapsulates there are many better slogans you could have, that encapsulates the essence of what you're trying to advocate for and defund the police. You should say something like, we want jobs, not jails. We want schools, not prisons, something like that. That immediately tells people not that you're trying to take away from public institutions right now and jumping on the austerity bandwagon, but that you're trying to expand opportunities at the expense of cops, at the expense of the police, so that the two go together. The way it is right now, it really, as you're saying, Paul, runs the risk of jumping on the austerity bandwagon rather than trying to reverse it. Personally, I don't think that the slogan's going to go very far. I think it's going to have a great future in ethnic studies programs and race studies programs, in seminar circuits, in academic conferences, and in parts of the nonprofit world. I think even in electoral politics, I do not think it's going to go very far, except in very, very safe congressional seats where candidates don't have to worry about being reelected and where they can use it as a way of gaining national prominence for themselves. Outside of that, I don't think it's going to be very successful.
to turn now to the question of capitalism and racism and kind of the relationship between the two, because I think something that we hear on the left a lot is that capitalism and racism are sort of inextricably bound up, and so that in order to defeat one, we have to defeat the other, or that we have to, quote, do both. And I think in a certain sense, there's some truth to that, insofar as, like, of course, we have to oppose racial oppression and racial discrimination and capitalist exploitation. But is this a useful framework for thinking about the relationship between capitalism and racism? And what do you think it means to do both?
Well, I think it is true that in order to eradicate racial oppression, you have to be anti-capitalist. I think that's true. By which we mean, in order to eradicate racial oppression, you need to funnel enormous resources to give racial minorities real avenues for self-representation, self-organization, to bargain against their bosses, to have all the public goods and the necessities of life. Without that, you will not eradicate racial oppression. So why does that require anti-capitalism? It's because all of those things are controlled by the class that has the economic assets and the economic wealth of society. That's the capitalist class. When we say you need to have a massive expansion of public employment, of healthcare, of high quality education, primary and secondary education, of childcare, all these things, we're talking about the expansion of social democracy. Now, you're not going to get the expansion of social democracy by having racial sensitivity seminars. Yeah, I mean, if you've ever seen it happen, please let me know, because it makes our job a lot easier, right? So it requires some kind of anti-capitalism in your politics, or I should say anti-capitalist politics. Now, that's if we conceptualize our agenda as an anti-oppression agenda. But if you think racism is discrimination, attitudes, social affronts, microaggressions, sure, you don't have to be anti-capitalist at all. In fact, I can guarantee you that you can make massive inroads against these things within capitalism. So there's two roads you can take. In my mind, the only way around an actual racial, to address racial oppression is through having some kind of labor-oriented politics in which you put the interests and the needs of the socially oppressed groups as central to your agenda.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that in America, discrimination is far more illegal than oppression. Types of oppression are becoming more illegal every day here. I want to talk about the legacy of Black Marxists, communists, and socialists who've advocated or organized around universal programs. And this idea now that people who are advocating for universal programs are against race-specific or race-sensitive programs. Can you talk about the shift in that kind of denialism of the history of Black radicalism, advocating for these programs, or the shift towards thinking that these programs don't go far enough in addressing race?
Let's make a distinction between race-sensitive and race-specific. I think one should support race-sensitive programs. You have to be aware that that any program that's universal in intent has to be especially cognizant of the liabilities and the weaknesses of socially oppressed groups, and make sure that the rights that are being and the allocations that are announced as being universal are in fact delivered to them. Because understandably, social attitudes, prejudicial attitudes towards those communities might get in the way of an adequate unrolling of these universal programs. So you must be race sensitive. Race specific, no. Why would any progressive support a race specific program unless you think the only people oppressed are those of a very particular race? You must, I think, support a universal advance in people's social position, especially in a country like the United States. If you think you're going to get the political leverage that it's going to take to direct resources at a racial minority without the support of other ethnic and racial groups, you're in wonderland. This is magical politics. You're not going to get the level of political power you need in order to address the situation of Black Americans unless you also have the support of the Latino and the white working class. And how are you going to get those support if you say, no, this is just for them, not for you. You get to the back. I would love to know the political program that seeks to move forward on this sort of agenda. The only way you get support from those other groups is by saying this is for everyone. But we have to make sure, given the history of this country, that everybody in fact gets it, because in the past, we haven't been very good about this. That's how you move forward. Outside of a universal agenda, you don't move forward. Now, Ariella, to your question, Black Marxism and Black radicalism, yes, I'll address that, but let's just say non-white radicals historically around the world in the 20th century. What I've just said, I didn't invent it. I'm simply telling you what every single Black or brown radical in the 20th century said until America handed to the world from the 1980s onward this nonsense that if you take up economic demands, you're not serious about race. This is an invention of the American post-80s American left. And we are now in the position of having to somehow drag ourselves out of this miasma, this psychological and intellectual malaise that the post-socialist so-called radical intelligentsia has generated, which has made us completely and totally irrelevant to ever doing anything meaningful on this very question of race.
So Vivek, on the subject of various radical traditions, I want to turn now to talking briefly about critical race theory, which of course is an academic discipline, but it's also something we've been hearing a lot about in the mainstream media this year, because Trump famously declared war on critical race theory after, the protests.
One of his better moments, actually.
Right? Well, I mean, on that note, we have a video clip of Trump kind of giving his speech inveighing against critical race theory. So let's watch this.
Students in our universities are inundated with critical race theory. This is a Marxist doctrine holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression, and that our entire society must be radically transformed. Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools. It's being imposed into workplace trainings, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families.
So on that note, what is critical race theory?
Very strong medication, doesn't he? Usually Trump
there's
is
something
pretty
a little
good in front of a mic. This is, you can tell, he sounds like a wind-up doll that's running out of power. He just faint and he's like
slumped over.
Yeah, he looks awful.
COVID, he had it longer than he said.
But Vivek, is critical race theory a Marxist plot?
No, of course not. There's nothing Marxist about it. We have to separate out certain strands here. Critical race theory, is something that came out of the academy. It's usually dated in the late 80s. People think of 1989, this conference in Wisconsin, as its founding moment. And it was really connected up with other trends in academia at the time. The immediate the parental theory was critical legal studies. And it was that right at the time that intersectionality theory was being promulgated and promoted. It comes out of a trend within academia where erstwhile radicals were trying to grapple with the how you understand racial and gender and sexual oppression. And initially, when it came up, it was taken for granted that there's an economic foundation to all this, that there's a material foundation to all this. So I would say that, in its very early version, there was a strong Marxist influence in this stuff because there was a strong Marxist influence on all strands of radical theory at that time. So there was this idea that race is fundamentally about power, which is right. That race is not deeply biological, that biological markers that individuals carry with them are fastened upon as having some kind of social significance, and that's a process of social construction. That's also true. And so it works with these tropes, as it were, and in so doing seems to be bringing race and the understanding of race into a materialist framework to enrich that framework. And there's an extent to which I think that's true. So one can't, at a certain level, I think, validate the accusation that this is a Marxist plot for the very early iteration of this. But keep the date in mind. We're talking about the late 80s. And the late 80s is the moment where radical thought enters its most profound degeneration that we've seen in the history of the modern left. I would date it a little bit earlier, but that's when it really starts to take off. So not surprisingly, by the time you get to the early 2000s, critical race theory has morphed into something quite different from its original starting point. It is now much more firmly embracing the milieu of intersectionality and what was called multiple oppressions theory, for whom the centrality or the foundational importance of economic inequality to the perpetuation of racial and gender injustice is no longer accepted. In fact, it's taken as a sign of intellectual weakness and even a kind of political conservatism. So by, I would say the early 2000s, in all of these intellectual strands, intersectional theory, intersectionality theory, critical race studies, and all that, you get, on the one hand, a nod to power and an affirmation of the social construction of these categories. But the social construction now is put on steroids. And it becomes an artifact of discourse and ideology and affect and these sorts of things. And now the cultural attitudinal components of race and racism become on par, are placed on par with the economic foundations of racial oppression. And this is why today you get from race theory and the race experts this notion that systemic racism is actually, when they interpret systemic racism, they mean racism is everywhere. And what keeps it everywhere is not the economic foundations on which it rests, but rather the attitudes that continue to reproduce it. And that's why the key to racism is sensitivity training, seminars, and this sort of stuff, more research, as you guys were talking about, and this notion that it's in the air and it's everywhere, and it rests in the most subtle gesture, in the tiniest inflection, in language. And all of this, by this time, by the 2000s, becomes a very different kettle of fish than the early foundations of it. But I would say the last 2 years, it takes on a different cast altogether. It starts out with this slogan of anti-essentialism. But by now, I would argue, it's a profoundly essentialist doctrine, but around race, not around class or economics. So that's what this 1619 Project in New York Times, I mean, if you look at the 1619 Project, what Trump's interpretation is not outlandish. It sees race as what it calls the original sin. It sees racism as inhering in white culture. It doesn't explain where it comes from. It's just there. And race is what produces and what generates the inequalities of society, not class. Race is the original sin, the ur category, that out of which flows everything else. And it's in everyone. No, that's what they mean by systemic racism. That's why all of us meaning white people, have to unlearn it. Well, I mean, then yeah, they got to take over the schools. You got to rewrite the textbooks. You got to Kendi has to be the czar of anti-racist scholarship. That there's a committee that'll pronounce on whether or not a textbook or an article is sufficiently anti-racist. That is a profoundly authoritarian trend. There's nothing Marxist about it.
If only Trump would watch this show, he would know that about critical race theory.
Listen, this is a fight. The left today is a left that sees no problem with all of these things that I'm criticizing right now. And it simply comes down to this. If the left is ever going to be relevant outside of these teeny tiny eddies, the professional managerial class, it's going to have to gather up the resolve to stand up and say, this is horseshit. And it's profoundly reactionary. I don't really care anymore. I've been doing this now for 30, 35 years. I'm to the point where I'm just tired of having to convince people who call themselves leftists that poverty and inequality is what your focus should be. The fact that you have to say this on the left is astonishing. It just shows that it's not a left anymore. It's something else. They should come up with a different name for themselves. I just don't know what to call it.
So my next question, how do you think this past year will impact the way the Democratic Party uses race politically in the years to come? Is this just the next phase of a long trajectory they've been in, or is this some kind of fundamental break? And I guess another way to put this is, will the politics of kente cloth photo ops, is that the new wave of the future, or is this going to be something else?
I do think that's their preferred route, Paul, and I think the reason for that, it's much more possible today for what's happened in 2020 to be a script for the future than it was in 1990 or so. And the reason for that is the Democrats have now, I think, realized that their electoral strategy for the near future, the next 10 to 20 years probably, is going to center on the suburbs. And the suburbs are no longer an all-white phenomenon. They are very diverse. And there is a substantial Black and Latino middle class. For that class of people, the interpretation of political programs around a kind of multicultural neoliberalism is very appealing. And the multicultural neoliberalism, in the sharper expressions of it, is what we might call a woke neoliberalism. That's going to work. It's going to work because, A, the multicultural suburbanites, remember that the bottom 40% of this country doesn't really vote. So working class Blacks and working class whites are out of the political equation. This is at a very high level of abstraction. Okay? Of course, they vote, but disproportionately, it's the wealthier people who vote. Among that top 55% that votes, there is now a substantial non-white middle class. For the Democratic Party, their strategy for 25 years has been to switch to the suburbs as fast and as hard as they can. The problem has been that there's also this culture war that they have to be embroiled in. Now, that culture war can be used not just against the Republican Party, but also against the incipient left within the Democratic Party. Because every time a Bernie Sanders or somebody else, maybe an AOC, says we need to have redistribution, you can say this is some race-blind horseshit, and it's just the view of white supremacists who want to deny the reality of race. So this is really going to work for the Democratic Party. And we're in a fluid moment. I'm not sure that we can make predictions beyond the middle run. But for the next couple of election cycles, I think you're going to see a lot more of this. And, you know, the media is going to love it. Academics are going to love it. They're going to pile on. And the left, if it doesn't have the strength of its resolve, and if it doesn't break out of the middle-class milieu that it's in, is going to have a very hard time.
Want to kind of tack back to your Catalyst article and ask about a more global perspective on this. So I was wondering if you can talk about the ways the left has combated middle-class nationalism in the post-colonial world, and if you can see any links between this professional managerial class, race essentialism, or anti-discrimination movement and those moments.
Well, you know, the race essentialism that we're seeing today on the left, and, you know, I guess we have to call it a left because that's what it is. It's very familiar to anybody who knows the history of the colonial world. This race essentialism, that is the idea that Black people or brown people have an autonomous culture of their own, that their experience as a group has a deep commonality to it, that they fundamentally have the same interests that emanate from their racial commonality and their racial essence. This view is a very old one. The only thing is, until America gifted the world this this view from the 1980s, it was always the view espoused by the right wing of the so-called the independence movements in the world. It was always the cultural conservatives who argued this, and the radicals expressed and espoused a universalistic and egalitarian ethos in which it was acknowledged that these so-called racial communities are deeply differentiated, that they have different interests within them, and the interests of the poor within them are not the same as the interests of the rich. And that was borne out by the entire history of the anti-colonial mobilization and the dispensations that took the place of the colonizers when you got independence. In the mobilizations, everywhere and always, the middle classes on up were very hostile to egalitarian demands and demands for land reform and workers' rights when the left raised them. And in fact, in a country like India, landlords never came over to the independence movement. They were on the side of the colonizers throughout, and the Indian bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, at best had an ambivalent relationship towards the independence movement because the independence movement was taking up real demands of redistribution. And the discourse that they used when they went up against these demands was the discourse that the so-called anti-racist left today uses, the race essentialists use. Now, for the left, throughout the 20th century, you had an ideological battle against the colonial masters and also against these race essentialists, because these race essentialists were denying the actual divergence of interest between brown and black elites and the working classes and peasants of those countries. So when today the Democratic Party, their academic, the intellectuals around them, the nonprofits and all these people come around and say demands for redistribution, demands for class interest ignore race, I've heard this 1,000 times. My grandfather could have told you what to make of this stuff because he was in the independence movement. He heard it 1,000 times. So the fact that it's brought about again today would not have been possible had the left coming out of the 50s and 60s in the US not been destroyed, had it not retreated into the academy and morphed into something else. What younger people today, your generation, is having to do is essentially relearn what was common knowledge through very deep and abiding experience for the left into the 1940s and 50s. We've gone back about 100 years ideologically in where the left is today.
All right, we got one more question for you. So early in the show, I talked about how Twitter founder Jack Dorsey donated $10 million to Ibram Kendi X's BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. But this is happening everywhere. I think something like over $2 billion in total has been given to quote unquote social justice organizations, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Walmart, etc. So, I mean, my question, what's going on here? What is the class logic of them giving that kind of money to these organizations? What's the logic of this?
Well, I think that it came for the American capitalist class and this kind of nonprofits left and grifters like Kendi. The George Floyd protest came at a very good time. For the capitalists, for the corporate community, I don't think the enthusiasm with which they jumped onto the anti-racist agenda would have been possible had the Bernie Sanders phenomenon not been so powerful and so effective for 5 years before it. This is the first time since the 60s where there was an explicit anti-corporate, anti-business political program brought into the mainstream of America. It was pretty amazing. I didn't think I would see it in my lifetime. But as you enter 2020, Sanders looks like he might actually take the Democratic ticket. And these guys are sweating bullets. They don't know what they're going to do. Now, thankfully, the Democratic Party is able to ride out that storm. Super Tuesday kills the Sanders ticket. But the impulse and the momentum of the anti-corporate agenda is still very much there. So when these protests happen, when the explosion happens, within 24, 48 hours, you get the corporate community coming out and saying, we support this, because it's an opportunity for them to rewrite their public image, not as robber barons, as bloodsuckers, as the destroyers of lives, but now as the cutting edge, the paragons of the issue in American society, which is racial justice. And luckily, they have these leagues and leagues and leagues of politicos, academics, and nonprofit movers and shakers who are willing to translate anti-racism and racial justice into this symbolic and anti-discrimination agenda. It gives a great opportunity for them to revive their public image. I do, if Paul, there's any agenda behind that, I see it as that. Then, of course, if you're looking for opportunities and you're a really rich guy to make donations and write it off, and this is a good way to do it for yourself. But politically, it seems like the closest we can come to a class interest behind it is to restore the legitimacy of the corporate community and to push back the left in doing so.
All right, I'm out of questions.
I think on that note, we're actually running up on our time. So again, thank you, Vivek, for being here for our inaugural episode. That was obviously fascinating, and I'm sure we'll be seeing much more of you.
This may actually make sure that you never get any viewers again.
Yeah, the first and last episode.
It's been quite a ride. I made a montage I'm going to show at the end of the whole ride.
All right, well, it was great to be on the show. And I really hope it works. And you three are doing a really important service, I think.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Vivek.
All right. So we've got a good list of enemies: Bezos, Musk,
right,
Dorsey,
the California NAACP lady.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, did I mention that she had to step down? She had to step down because it turns out when you accept political lobbying money, a lot of people get angry.
What a blow to diversity, though.
Proposition 22 lives on, unfortunately.
Right. Sorry, just a quick aside. Recently, we had a DSA Labor Committee meeting, and I had someone from Rideshare Drivers United talk about Proposition 22. And I mean, he said they were outspent 11-1. And these companies were so slick about the ads they put out about, how they help people of color who are entrepreneurs, so.
Oh my God, totally. No, they were so sleazy. They were so sleazy.
Yeah.
I remember hearing about Uber, having pop-up messages on the app being like, you should support Prop 22.
Right.
And I know that Instacart was putting stickers on people's grocery bags, support Prop 22. It was just the sleaziest campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was pretty sad hearing people say Florida, went for Trump, but voted for these progressive referendums. And then California, that's liberal, supported Prop 22. I don't think that's the whole story there. And there was so much money that was poured into that. And the very cynical angle of being you know what Black people and brown people want? It's not healthcare. It's not benefits. They want the freedom to work for nothing whenever they choose. Well, the app chooses for them. But yeah, it's modern day sharecropping for Uber. It's pretty horrible. But diversity. Well, I want to thank both of you. I had a ton of fun on the show. I always like talking to Vivek. I'm really proud of what we accomplished here. I wanted to say a quick word about Michael Brooks, who is a friend of mine. Really rare person on the left in general. He would call every week and ask how we were doing during the pandemic and just check in. Really sweet, wonderful, kind, and open. And this show was his vision. And I think we've taken it up, and I hope we can make him proud.
I feel like his spirit lives on in 90% of the left shows on the internet right now. So add this one.
But we have to get better at doing impressions.
That's true. And he's one of those. He was one of those people. I never met him. Every episode I'd be like, man, I can't wait to meet Michael. I can tell we're gonna vibe. So yeah, it's just so sad.
Yeah. Well, let's brush up on our impressions and get back into the next show.
Hey, I got a lot up my sleeve, so don't say that. I'm gonna run wild with it if you encourage me too much. So
next episode.
Yeah, get ready.
All right. Well, thanks to you both and to everybody watching, and good night, guys.
Good night.